We can now bring in Hussein Ibish, senior resident scholar at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for joining us here on the program today. It seemed like the ceasefire deal in place between Israel and Hamas was on very shaky ground last week, but then over the weekend we saw Hamas release the hostages on its end, and then Palestinian prisoners were freed by Israel. Are things more solid now?
I think a little bit, yes. Look, Hamas really wants the second phase to go forward because they are reemerging as the power in Gaza. They're rebuilding their civil authority every day in different parts of Gaza. And this is a strategic choice by Israel to prefer the reemergence of Hamas in Gaza to anything that might be connected to the PLO and the PA in Ramallah, because that's the Palestinian entity that could form a state, right? Hamas is not going to be able to form a state. It's too radioactive, too extreme, and that's not even its project. So ultimately, Israel has a choice. Either it can go along with President Trump and enter into phase two, which, as Noga just pointed out really well, will mean the end of the war. And that will mean essentially the return of Hamas rule in Gaza, the one thing Israel said it would never accept. Or they can go ahead and start scrambling to do the thing they've never done since the beginning of the war, which is start arranging for an alternative, which would be a PLO, PA-connected alternative regime in Gaza, and they just don't know what to do. Or they could go back to the war, which is would really infuriate Donald Trump.
Now, Marco Rubio was in Israel over the weekend where he discussed Donald Trump's plan to transfer the Palestinian population out of Gaza. This is ethnic cleansing. It's a non-starter for Arab states. So why are we still talking about it if the only one on board is Benjamin Netanyahu?
Well, we're talking about it because the person who's blathering this gibberish is in the White House, right? So that means that diplomats and government officials and journalists all over the world have no choice but to take it seriously. I mean, he could say, and then we're going to colonize Jupiter. And people would all run around talking about the feasibility of colonizing Jupiter. It's about as remote as that. I think those of us who are not diplomats and government officials ought to just do the public a favor and say, there's no Trump Gaza plan. There's no alternative Gaza plan. There's only, this is all just complete, lysergic LSD nonsense, right? What it is some sort of either negotiating ploy or bloviating, or maybe Trump is setting up something for the West Bank, for annexation in the West Bank as compensation to Israel when he tries to do a nuclear deal with Iran, which is a relatively light lift. It could be something like that. But the Palestinians in Gaza are not going anywhere. There's nowhere for them to go.
Because it seems that Donald Trump would not want to put his ultimate goal, which is normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia, in jeopardy, given that Saudi Arabia has said there won't be any normalization with Israel without a Palestinian state.
So my view, honestly, is that Saudi normalization has now taken a back seat to a deal with Iran. I think Saudi normalization is a very heavy lift because it requires Israel to at least recognize the Palestinian right to a state between the river and the sea in what is they call Eretz Israel, in Israel and the occupied territories. The Israelis are not prepared to do that. And that's the minimum the Saudis could take. And they're not going to do it. Whereas a deal with Iran is just sitting there ready to be done. It's a very light lift at this point because Trump needs it, the Iranians need it, both sides need it, and the only problem is it's going to infuriate the Israelis and their evangelical and Jewish friends in the United States. So Trump has to compensate them with something. And I think he's teeing up annexation in the West Bank. And all this talk about Gaza just sets an atmosphere about Palestinians and their rights and their obligations and where they should be and go and their land that can be then transferred into the West Bank from a fake thing in Gaza that can't be done to a very real thing that can easily be done in the West Bank.
Hussein, talks to enter phase two of the current ceasefire that's in place were due to begin 2 weeks ago. They haven't started. Netanyahu has been dragging his feet more so after he visited his friend Donald Trump in the White House. But at the same time, it's been 500 days since those hostages were taken into Gaza. Where's the sense of urgency on the part of the Israelis?
Well, there is one, in fact. It's there in the public, which wants all the hostages released, and that means doing phase two, because all the hostages are released at the end of phase two, which, as Noga pointed out in your package there, means the end of in effect, means the end of the war. And Netanyahu doesn't want that, but you know who does? The Israeli public wants it. And the Israeli military wants it, because right now they're fighting a war and they're bleeding soldiers. Every week they lose several to an insurgency with no goal. There's no purpose here. There's no articulated end. So they're pressuring him. Donald Trump is pressuring him because he wants all the hostages out, which means phase two. Everybody's pressuring him except the ultra-right in Israel, which he relies on to stay in power. So he's in a complete bind, right? Everyone wants phase two except the people he relies on to stay in power within the cabinet. He doesn't know what to do. So it's really a big problem. And by the way, the ultimate question is, that means Israel would be making a strategic choice to leave Hamas in power in Gaza. And that would mean a total failure of this devastating, brutal, near genocidal war that they've fought for the past year and a half. And that's a terrible thing.
Because at the end of 15 months, what we have seen, every time Hamas releases a batch of hostages, it's demonstrating to the world with those Hollywood-style productions which we've seen, that they are very much in control.
Of course. But there's no one else, because they're in control because Israel decided to leave them in control. There has been an alternative on the table since November of 2023, right? Since a few weeks after the war began, everybody from the Americans to the Europeans to the Arabs and the Asians and others were talking about the need for an alternative civil administration in Gaza. But the problem for Israel is it would be tied directly or indirectly back to Ramallah, back to the PLO and the PA. And they fear the PLO and the PA more than they fear Hamas, because they are the ones who could create a Palestinian state. And Hamas will not, because it's radioactive, and it's not even Hamas's project to create a Palestinian state. So they have preferred to leave Hamas in power. It's a strategic decision.
But I just want to jump in there, because the problem with the Palestinian Authority is, does it have any legitimacy given Mahmoud Abbas's tenure, which has gone on forever?
Yeah, okay. So the Palestinian Authority has a lot of legitimacy problems, but it has legitimacy in the international community. He's not only the head of the PA, he's the head of the PLO. And everyone, even Hamas, agrees that the PLO represents the Palestinians diplomatically. And he is still the leading Palestinian. There's never been a leader of Hamas who could challenge him as a national leader. And so despite all the crisis of legitimacy you rightly point out, yes, he could. And it wouldn't be him. It would be someone else, like Salam Fayyad or Mahmoud Ahlan or some businessman or somebody who would be the titular head of a civic administration. And it might even, to please the Israelis, be nominally independent. But in fact, it would draw its legitimacy from the PLO, ultimately, leading back not just to Abbas, but the whole wretched crew in Ramallah. But are they legitimate? Well, sure they are, yes.
Hussein Ibish, thank you so much for joining us on the program today with your insights.